Trees are valuable assets in our landscapes, communities, and cities, but various elements can jeopardize or shorten the life of these monuments in nature. Now, insects and diseases can play a big role in shortening the life of trees, but there's another category that I'd like to share with you, what I call physiological problems that are not insect or disease related that can also jeopardize the health of the trees. Now, I want to cover various categories, and the first one of physiological problems are what we call chemical elements. And I've got a good example here of what we refer to as a fertilizer deficiency on a pin oak. And it's a very big problem here in the Stillwater area, but it's actually a result of a pH imbalance in the soil. And as a result of the imbalance, there are certain nutrients that aren't being taken up into the tree, such as iron, and so it causes this yellowing appearance, and year after year after year it shortens the life, branches die, and you can lose the tree. So that's a problem of a deficiency. Now also with fertilizer, it seems like if people see a problem with trees, and we may think of it as a root problem, it seems like the cure-all answer for a lot of people is putting more fertilizer on trees, and that's not always the case. If it is a root problem from another reason and you're putting fertilizer on, you can actually burn or harm the root system and cause more harm to the tree. So you need to make sure there's a reason that you're applying fertilizer and check your soil pH. Now another area that's under the chemical elements is that of herbicides. And it's not uncommon for a lot of people to use pre-emergence herbicides in their lawn. An example of one might be like Dacthal, that's a pre-emergence for crabgrass. Now you need to think about the root system of the tree, because some of the herbicides you can actually put in your lawn and the roots may be growing out in that area and you can cause damage to the trees. So read the label. This particular one says it's okay to use around trees and shrubs. And the same thing holds true if you're putting herbicides in flower beds. If tree roots are in those areas, you better check and read the label so you don't cause some unwanted damage. Now another practice of using herbicides in a landscape or in municipality areas is by applying a herbicide that's like a soil sterilant in sidewalks or parking lots to keep the grass from growing up in those areas. And these two can drift into root zones of trees that you may not think about and cause problems. Again, burning of the foliage, decline of the tree, and possible death. So again, we need to be careful on how we're applying herbicides. Now, of course, both of these practices, whether it's soil applied in a lawn or in a municipality type area, are really not intentional poisonings of trees, but I'd like to bring you up to date about a report that happened back in 1989 with the famous treaty oak in Austin, Texas. Now, of course, it gained worldwide attention, and it was based on an intentional poisoning using a herbicide. Now, I'd like to remind you of what happened. The live oak, which is referred to as a treaty oak, was about 500 years old. It was a holy place for Native Indians to conduct various business. It was also the site for the settlement with the city of Austin. It was such a popular tree and so beautiful that the citizens of Austin actually purchased the lot that the tree was on in 1930 by various fundraising, a lot of which was money raised by children just in coin collections. It became a popular place for parks and picnics and weddings. But in 1989, an individual poisoned the tree by pouring a herbicide in a figure-8 pattern around the tree. And he did it for the reason of a ritual to attract a woman that he was infatuated with. Well, he put enough herbicide on that was actually used for killing trees, but it was through a registered type practice, so it wasn't easy to get a hold of. He put enough on to kill 25 trees of the same size. Well, obviously he didn't get the woman, but he did get 9 years in prison. Now, the symptoms of the herbicide are the same that you might see in some of your own practices, again, with herbicide applications. You'll see green veins, and you'll see a lot of yellowing or necrotic midribs. Again, the foliage starts to defoliate and drop. And with the live oak, since it's an evergreen, the next flush of growth actually had more symptoms on it than the older leaves that were on when it was applied. Now, they knew something was wrong with the tree, so they did a soil test, and that's how they identified it was a herbicide damage. They came in and removed the soil and tried not to damage the roots during that process, at least where the herbicide was applied. They replaced it with new soil and microorganisms to help break down the herbicide they couldn't get. They went to the expense of putting up 50-foot shades and screens to shade the tree and protect it from wind damage, and they cooled it with thousands of gallons of water by a misting system trying to keep the tree alive. They also applied nutrient injections in the tree. Again, it was so important to try to save the tree that they put a lot of time and money in it. Well, some 4 years later, I had the opportunity to visit the tree recently, and only 1/3 of the tree remains. So you'll see all of the nice intentions that they put into the tree and the efforts was really just kind of prolonging the tree. It's gradually dying a slow death. And again, it's a dramatic type of example, but it can happen in your own landscape. So you want to be very careful with it. Herbicides can also cause damage to trees by drift, especially when using 2,4-D type herbicides. And a case in point was a recent tree that we visited with you on Oklahoma Gardening with the hanging tree in Tulsa. And I have a slide showing some of the distortion of the foliage on the very outside or new growth. Now also with chemicals, be careful with de-icers in the winter because some of them contain salt products that can damage tree roots, and there are other products that you can use that don't have salt in them. Also, be careful of draining oil around construction sites or leaky cars. Any kind of petroleum products can also harm trees. Now the second category is site disturbance. We've talked about how lowering the grade and cutting away the tree roots, we have a good example of new construction here in Stillwater that's doing that. Also, if you raise the grade or bring soil in, you can smother the roots out. And if you put a tree well around a tree, make sure that you have an area where you'll get drainage so water doesn't hold. And an example of that would be a tree in Ardmore area that we visited. Also compaction, the famous hanging tree in Tulsa that we just talked about, we also noticed cars parking under it, and during construction and other practices that compaction can also harm the trees. Now this third category is environmental stress, and if you'll remember the early freeze in the fall of 1991, we're still seeing damage. We have Bradford pears here in Stillwater that are damaged up around the branch area. Also mulberry tree where the dead branches on the end, and also a lot of trees where they were damaged where the bark split right at the ground level, and those symptoms may show up for years to come and shorten the life of the tree. Also be concerned about drought that occurs. Leaf drop that can happen during the summer when we get lack of moisture. Also waterlogged soil, the opposite of that, when we have a lot of spring rains and water standing can harm trees. Pollution, when you leave your car running or let it warm up in the wintertime in the same place by trees. Pollution, or trees in parking lots where there's a lot of auto exhaust. And then remember other things like lightning, and probably one of the worst things that happens in a landscape is the weed eater damage, which you'll see here on this particular one, or lawnmowers. That really harms a tree. Improper pruning practices and just planting the tree in the wrong place can also harm your trees and shorten the life. Probably the most frustrating thing about all of the stresses that we've talked about are that the symptoms all look the same depending on the stress. Now, you might see things like leaf scorch on the foliage, or even browning in between the veins like on this redbud leaf. Or you may see dark margins or distortion of the foliage or leaf drop or just abnormalities of the foliage, and even the branches may start thinning out. And just by looking at these symptoms, you really can't pinpoint the problem. So again, you have to ask yourself 20 questions. And it's really a process of elimination. If you know there's no insects or disease on here, it doesn't look that way, well, you can eliminate that and think about the other practices. And the other thing you need to really remember is that trees don't heal, they just cover up the damage. And I have a slide showing a cross-section of a tree trunk where you can see damage that was occurred and it just covered up on that damage. And also remember that tree roots, with the new research, are showing that there's some 90% of the tree roots are in the top 12 inches, so trees are very shallow rooted. And really, if you ask the question, what can you do? Well, unfortunately, there's not a lot you can do, as in the case with the treaty oak in Texas. Really, the answer is protection. you need to think about what might happen as a result of the practice that you're going to incorporate or a result of your actions. Just draining the swimming pool on a regular basis, the chlorine from that, if you do it in your lawn, can harm tree roots and other plant materials. So think about what you're doing and be observant of your surroundings. And if you're really still confused or you have more questions or you're not sure what your practice will have an impact on, be sure and consult an urban forester, maybe a horticulture professional, your local garden centers, or even your county extension office again. And hopefully, just by being aware of your environment and thinking about the practice and what the end result may be, you can protect these trees and get lots of enjoyment from years to come.